Elizabeth Hinton, Michael Eric Dyson, thank you for being here. Thank you for what you do. I'm Doug Blackmon. See you next week.
You were amazing.
Was okay?
You were great.
That was great. That was fun. We got to do this again.
I know.
Thank you ever so much for such an informative talk. But my question, I did not hear the word jobs. Could you please elucidate on that a little bit?
The word jobs.
Jobs. Yep.
Well, I talked a lot about mass unemployment. I mean, I really think that this and the kind of limited view of a lot of social welfare programs that focus on, and the war on poverty, which was really, a thrust of job training programs without job creation programs. And so the way that I understand the root causes of poverty and crime really, I mean, of course, deteriorating housing, unequal access to a decent education, all of these contribute to poverty and crime, but really the root problem is jobs. And of course we see Johnson's call for the war on crime and the rise of mass incarceration coinciding with the decline of domestic manufacturing in the US. And so the problem of jobs, I think, is central to many of our domestic problems today.
Mm-hmm. But neither of you in your essays, if I recall correctly,
Yeah.
I'm hesitant about citing anything. There is a view out there that that ultimately the Obama administration's efforts to invest in infrastructure and such, which is a de facto job creation sort of program, but the absence of investment in capital, either intellectual capital or the structure of the country, that I think Jeffrey Sachs actually just wrote a piece, an op-ed piece that I read earlier today about this, but the idea that an aggressive program of government investment in things like infrastructure and such is in fact a job creation initiative of the scale that's needed to address this sort of an issue, and that ultimately the Obama administration never really could, whether it was their fault or not, could never quite pull off.
Well, but I mean, look, think about that. So, no, I don't think anyone would argue with that, but it certainly is not going to be targeted toward.
Right, it's not group specific in the way that you say that it should be.
And that's the point.
Yeah.
If you say, let's keep helping the hand, but it's the little pinky that's the problem.
Right.
The little pinky is in a cast here. If we don't address the problem with the little pinky, the hand will not be. Look, we keep saying, no, not the pinky, the hand. It's not the finger, it's the hand. Well, it is the finger, because the fingers constitute those individual members that make the strength endure or deplete it. And I think that when we look at the jobs problem, when I talk about CETA and Neighborhood Youth Corps, those are job programs that were generated out of the Johnson administration that I took particular advantage of in Detroit, Michigan, as a poor black child.
I did see that too. It's a poor white child.
Well, exactly. No. I mean, that's why Lyndon Baines Johnson.
They're great programs.
They're right. That's why Lyndon Baines Johnson, if you look at the recent film All the Way, said, I'm a poor white guy. That inspired me to do the Great Society as well. So I think that if you don't look at the capital that's being bled in Harlem as people leave over Harlem to go across the seas and ponds and exploit, when you've got unexploited markets right here in America, that some investment would certainly help, and also the creation of particular kinds of jobs. If you look at the jobs report of the Obama administration, which has been pretty remarkable, which is why I've argued, if you're a white person in America doing relatively well, you should be thanking God for President Obama, because he done hooked y'all up in a big way, right? The many people who are not in those jobs reports are those who are persistently poor, and those who are discouraged from finding work, and those who can't get a job in this economy. And when you look at even the distribution of the resources initially that Bush put into play, but that Obama executed in terms of TARP money and the like, they even did a racial breakdown of that geographically, and the most, if you will, diverse states, the non-diverse states got the largest amount of money, and the diverse states got the least amount of money. So even there, that blind mechanism of distribution doesn't help the problems that obtain in these poor communities of color, and even in poor white ones for that matter.
Sure, let's go to Marcus Martin there in the center. And if you can't stand.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Marcus.
Well, Professor Dyson, welcome back again. Professor Hinton, back again. I think you've been here before too, haven't you?
Not on
Thank-
the show, but in the military.
Yes, but here. Both very eloquent, and thank you for all the strong work you do. And Doug, thank you for the invitation. My question was more of a comment, and then you can comment on it as well. So I'm Vice President and Chief Officer for Diversity and Equity, but I'm also a professor of emergency medicine. And a symptom that hits close to home with what I do is the lack of African American males in medical school. And I think a lot of people in the room know this, you probably know this as well. I graduated from medical school in 1976, and in 1978 we had roughly 1,400 plus African American male applicants to medical school. 35 years later, in 2014, we're down to less than that, somewhere in the 1,300, so less over 35 years. Same thing in terms of matriculation, a little bit over 500 African American males graduating from medical school in 1978, but less than that in 2014. Now, we can account for some of that loss with multiracial students, multicultural, biracial, but even when you include those who are African American, biracial, that number is still poor. So 2/3 of the African Americans graduating from medical school are women, and only 1/3 male. So you look at that and look at the timeline, all the things you're talking about in terms of poverty, lack of mentorship, incarceration, lack of opportunity, and the big deal is for any student facing college and medical school, where are you going to get the money, when there's going to be a $200,000 debt related to medical school training. So something directed has to happen much better than what we're doing currently. And so your thoughts on that would be wonderful to hear.
Thank you.
Well, part of it is transforming our education system and giving people an actual route to obtain a college education. I think, part of it is we need to look at and reach students who are coming from extremely low income backgrounds and give them, again, this is part of the larger point, rethinking how we allocate resources, who has access to resources and mobility. This kind of goes to a point that Professor Dyson raised about punishment in schools, but it also goes to resources that are allocated to schools. He said that Johnny gets sent to the principal's office and Shaquille gets put in a police car and sent to jail. It's a similar thing that we see. Suburban public schools in this country are excellent. Many public schools are excellent. The suburban public schools are excellent. The rural and urban public schools have teachers who are not experienced, get third generation textbooks, the hand-me-downs from the suburban schools. Many schools, especially in urban communities, feel like are fortified. They feel like you're going to a prison. There's metal detectors and police in the hallways and barbed wires. That doesn't make going to school necessarily a pleasant experience. That doesn't necessarily keep kids safer. So I think part of it is thinking about our resources and thinking about how we can redistribute resources to people who have been systematically excluded and marginalized from getting access to a textbook that was written in the past few years, and if they can't afford it, as in Western European countries, access to a college education to study what they want to study and what they're passionate about.
And can I briefly just jump in? Besides that brilliant analysis, think about it. 76, when is Bakke? Affirmative action, right around 77, 78. So then you've got the assault upon the supposed privilege of African Americans in an affirmative action where, ironically enough, the greatest beneficiaries of affirmative action have been white women, and then white people in general because of other able people being subsumed under that rubric. So what you have now is an explicit attack upon the so-called unfair access of African American people, which I can bet you, I haven't crunched the numbers, I can bet you the complaints of many white people who were denied access because of black people's access. Come on. I mean, that argument is still being made, Fisher, University of Michigan, and so on. But I bet if you crunch the numbers, a whole lot more white folk didn't get in and become doctors, but a whole lot fewer African American and Latino people did. And so it had its desired effect, according to the crafters, of reverse racist ideology that undercut what happened in these African American and Latino communities. And again, as a result of that, some could argue, well, black women or women of color in general may have benefited because they were both female and a person of color. But I think that also denies the way in which they've had a double whammy effect imposed upon them and their persistence. I mean, if we could interview what black women and brown women have done to persist even in the face of those odds. It's not just the structural factors that need to be taken into account, but also the extraordinary narratives of persistence that these women have been able to marshal in the face of such enormous odds as well.
Can I just add one comment to that?
Sure.
I think, another issue that I spoke with Dr. Lewis Sullivan, who's former Secretary of Health and Human Service, and a guy by the name of Damon Tweedy, who wrote Black Men in a White Coat. So we had them here doing Festival of the Book, and I narrated the session with them, and we talked about this. Another thing is, back during my day, we had National Medical Fellowship scholarships that were directed to minorities to get through medical school. So then you have these students who come from families that don't have the money, and so you go back to the days of slavery to now, the ratio of the lack of dollars in black families, to put the students in school who may want to go. So rather than going to medical school, they will go a different route because they know it's too expensive to go that route. So that's part of the symptom as well. Yeah.
Yeah, you may have heard me say this before, but when I'm speaking around the country about things related to this, I acknowledge that a lot of people really struggle with affirmative action because it does create, if you look at it just in the current moment, it is discriminating against somebody else. It's true. That's sort of positive, hopefully positive discrimination. But I will often joke with an audience. I'll say, yeah, everywhere I go, I keep looking for this guy whose life was ruined by affirmative action. This white guy, I just can't find him. Has anybody met this guy? Anybody know this white guy who just his life was just ruined by affirmative action? And and I'll say I can always find people who wanted to be a fireman and passed and failed the written exam when they did the fireman's test, and who went home and told their mama that night that I couldn't be a fireman because they're only hiring blacks. I can find that guy everywhere. But every now and then when I use that as a device mostly to get people thinking about it. Every now and then somebody will say, "Well, no, I'm that guy. I'm the white guy whose life was ruined by affirmative action." And then I'll stop and say, "So, well, okay, tell your story. How did that happen?" And then it's almost always a version of medical school or law school that I was at the top of my class as an undergraduate and I'd done really well, and I applied to the law school that was, the law school in my world that you applied to, and then I didn't get in because of the affirmative action program they had in place that, these African Americans were there. And I'll say, okay, I understand your frustration over that. That would frustrate me too, if I was, if that was my life. And then I'd say, so what have you been doing the last 35 years? And they always say, oh, I'm a lawyer. And I say, well, what? How did that happen? I thought you couldn't get into law school. Are you breaking the law? Are you practicing without a license? How did that happen? And they say, oh, I went to the other best law school in my state. And I got in there. And so but it is an extraordinary thing, not to overload it, but that I do think it's an empirical statement that affirmative action was the most effective approach to these kinds of issues you guys have been talking about of anything else, because it cost almost nothing, injured almost no one, and had such tremendous impact over such a long, positive impact over such a long period of time.
And a couple of things. First of all, if you look at the numbers of people who are ahead of those people who are ruined, and imagine some injury, there are a bunch of white people in front of them as well, as opposed to black people, and a lot behind them. So there's no correlation between race and empirically verifiable quantities of black people or brown people who got over it. But number two, read the book by Ira Katz-Nelson, When Affirmative Action Was White.
Right.
Yeah, affirmative action was a huge thing. Returning soldiers from World War II, most of them were not people of color. They got to hook up on the test to get into school. They got to hook up on getting a housing loan, and you got a job. Those are three of the most powerful entrees into the middle class that created, not on your own hard work, not because you were smarter than anybody else, but because you got a leg up in an affirmative action assist in the ways we speak about it that are barely talked about and never spoken of in polite circles where affirmative action is talked about in those racial terms.
Yeah, let's take a question here. Yeah, Mr. Lineweaver. Welcome back. You've been out of the country, haven't you?
I was out to the Dominican Republic, and I'm on the way to Canada. And this was a great. Didn't I meet you a few weeks ago?
Yes.
Yeah.
Last time I was
This is particularly interesting to me because my distant cousin is Dr. Gates of Harvard, and
Skip
he was
Gates.
arrested for breaking into his own house.
I would not have guessed that Skip Gates was your cousin.
But
that is me making
wanna broaden-
wrong-headed assumptions.
I think the problem of the first year of the presidency is the problem of the first year of the president. If you read Christopher Bolas's book, The Shadow of the Object, every president that's running had a mother. And the first year, from conception to age 4, creates his unconscious. And the decisions that President Obama made, or any president, or all these guys running for president, was instrumental in determining their unconscious racism or the lack of it. And the problems that Obama has is based on being from a biracial origin.
Can I pluck something out of that? Because that I actually wanted to ask these guys about earlier, and that is that this idea that and Michael, you and I have talked about this before. This question of President Obama's blackness, and this thing that aggravated him to no end, aggravated Attorney General Holder to no end. That it particularly bothered Holder that people would say, well, you're black, but he's really not black. He's not black enough. He's missing the quotient of rage that every African American man is born with, and that sort of has to drive their blackness in some sense. But that whole thing, and you've written about that. You've talked about that. Yeah. But is there the fact that Barack Obama had a white mother and did not have a black father around much of the time, and grew up in a world that was not at all culturally black in a sense, and that he's a dark-skinned person, but had to find his way to his blackness, as maybe some would say, not necessarily me. But I mean, is that an element of his being cautious and limiting in his approach to some of these issues?
I don't know if it's an element. For me, I mean, in some ways, this gets at the kind of flip side of what we've been talking about with affirmative action. I think what's significant is that his father was Kenyan. His father, he is not the descendant of people who were enslaved in the United States. And again, I know that I keep on bringing up slavery, but it's key to everything that we're talking about tonight. And so that in some ways shows just how difficult, and it's a little disappointing that the first black president wasn't someone who was the descendant of slavery, people. Right. Exactly. And I think that reflects in some ways the barriers, how difficult it is, and the ways in which these legacies still shape mobility, shape access to resources, shape the nature of our inequality. And we see it even in college, the affirmative action in terms of college admissions. A lot of the people who are counted as African Americans who get into college are also similarly not descended from slaves. So again, we really have to deal with the ways in which, for generations, 4 generations, 5 generations, the descendants of slaves have been unable to realize or fully realize the promises of what people call the American dream or the founding values of this country.
And that's that brilliant, encapsulation of the problem avoids the knee-jerk reaction to Obama. Oh, you sell out, you Oreo, right? That we have no truck with that kind of madness. Right. But what it does suggest on the flip side, what that covers against, what that hedges against, is the reality. You said it just even in the explaining it, you had to answer the question. Yes, of course it makes a difference who your mama is, and who your daddy is, and what your relationship is, and how you understand them, and how it's shaped his self-understanding and his appeal to a broader America. The fact that he's not an angry Negro, that he's not a black man, that black folks say, we love you, you're our kind of guy. That's why I tell white America, if you don't love Barack Obama, ain't a Negro been made you're gonna really dig.
You're articulate and clean.
Right. Very clean, very articulate, so fresh and so clean, and outcast
don't
epistemology.
go hating on Vice President Biden.
No, I love Biden, but I'm saying that at the end of the day, it does make a difference in terms of how you perceive the world. And let me give you an example. The former Secret Serviceman who wrote 2 books. The second book he wrote about, in part, his White House detail, wrote about the Obamas, said they loved Michelle Obama because she was very nice and she would touch them. She was very sweet. They loved that. And she would get on Obama for making them late. Like, look, dude, they They have jobs too. So why are you making? They loved her for that. But what they didn't like her for was because she was hard on the Republicans, my girl, and in the front of the detail, in the black presidential limo with Obama in the back seat, they overheard Michelle Obama saying to him, every now and again, take the black people's side. Now, first of all, why your wife got to tell you? Right, that's number one. Then you scare like, damn, she got to really tell you this? So we're grateful that she's there, but what about if she wasn't? Look at the historical contingency that determines all these big issues. The fact is that Obama may not necessarily feel an intuitive grasp of what, as a result of legacies and histories and traditions, other people have. So there's a tremendous tension. Professor Hinton alluded to it. Half the people getting into Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Georgetown who are black are directly from African descent, which is great, or from the Caribbean at some level. So the point is, the indigenous native black person is getting left behind because they're perceived as the thug, the outcast, the Caribbean hardworking, the African smart. So now you begin to reproduce the stereotypes that allow certain people to be elevated and others to be held back. Obama is a product of all that, and to pretend that's not the case, or to pretend when he says, I've been on both sides, not black enough and too black. Well, who's saying you were too black? The white Americans who didn't understand the complications of race. Who said you weren't black enough? Maybe it was a fumbling, inarticulate way of black people saying, we got a suspicion and skepticism about what your life has looked like and what it will lead you to conclude, and as a result of that, we want to interrogate. That's what's going on right there, to me.
Suppose that Trump does become president. What about what either he has said or the people who mainly support him has said, what leads you to believe that life for African Americans under a Trump presidency would be better than life under Obama's presidency has been?
Not too much.
Yeah.
He said the blacks like him
Yeah, I don't.
because he'll bring us jobs. Yeah, right. Not a damn thing.
Yeah, I can't. And I am very worried, especially, we see this reintroduction, and Obama has used this rhetoric with respect to deporting immigrants, this rhetoric of excluding the criminals and getting the gangbangers. He uses that rhetoric when he's talking about immigration, similar to Trump. I mean, more people have been deported under Obama than any presidency. So I worry that we're gonna, with Trump, even the little inches that we've moved forward in terms of criminal justice reform, we're going to take 20 steps back, and we're going to see that reintroduction in a new way. Of course, it'll be historically distinct rhetoric, but these ideas of super predators, the idea that entire groups of people need to be locked up for long terms and throw away the key, I really worry that will be reintroduced into popular discourse, maybe in part as a reaction to some of the more liberal or transformative rhetoric about anti-black racism that we've seen emerging in the past few years. So unfortunately, I can't really see anything getting better unless we keep on, as I mentioned during the program, placing those demands on our elected officials to enact policies that we want to see that do take into account racism and inequality.
That's brilliant. I'll say this, but it occurs to me as Professor Hinton is speaking, perhaps this is, a bit problematic to many, but in one sense, Obama, in terms of being the mass deporter that he is actually achieving what Donald Trump only could dream of in terms of mass deportation, right? Because Obama has the deporter-in-chief, La Raza, which called him that. Not to his face, but in public space, has rendered problematic his practices that a Trump presidency could never get away with because he's already under such a microscope that people are looking and making sure that this doesn't happen. So Obama, without being scrutinized, is achieving what Trump. So really, Barack Obama is Trump's whole card, and in that sense, and achieving, I think, in a subterranean fashion, in a very problematic one, what Trump could only imagine. Look, there's no argument that Trump himself, even though he called Obama, he led the birther movement for 2 years, and really said this man was delegitimized. Then he tried to ask about his grades. Look at how it metastasized. First it's about his birth certificate ain't right. Then he didn't deserve to get into Columbia or Harvard. Your only claim to intelligence is your uncle was a professor at MIT. So now I think Donald Trump has raised the specter of such horrid, racist practices that he will be held to account in a way, because he's ginned up the debate and ratcheted up the discourse in a way that the response, this is what I take Susan Sarandon and others to mean, that the response will be so scrutinizing of Donald Trump that he may be held to more account, ironically enough, than a Barack Obama, who, because his skin is black, has done things that are deeply and profoundly problematic vis-a-vis the issue of race. But in terms of, having been shouted out by so many rappers that Donald Trump is proud of, he's been shouted out by more rappers than any presidential candidate, maybe that's true, or that he's got more fast relationships with, black people than anybody else, that may be true as well, but that shows you at the end of the day, none of that matters in terms of public policy, what you do,
right.
the impact it has on the public. And even if you are not yourself a racist, you amplify the worst racist impulses in America in a way that Barack Obama certainly has not, that Hillary Clinton would not threaten to do, and Bernie Sanders. So in that sense, his problem to us is not what he represents as an existential example. It is the amplification of the worst tendencies in the culture that he draws to himself, that he allows to have a voice in his own administration. I think that would be extremely dangerous and problematic.
Why didn't that
Very well
happen
put.
to Hitler, Mussolini, and Frank?
That's a question that we will save for another day. For a second,
Trump is crypto fascist.
thank you very much.